In August 1943, a train pulled into Clinton Depot carrying 200 German soldiers, and folks in town came down to watch, even though it was a Tuesday afternoon, and most should have been working. They lined the platform and the street beyond, mothers holding children's hands, old men who remembered the First War, teenagers who'd soon be shipping out themselves, all of them staring as enemy soldiers stepped onto Mississippi soil for the first time. The Germans climbed down one by one from the passenger cars, not cattle cars like you might expect, but regular passenger trains with seats and windows, young men with sunburned faces and faded Afrika Korps uniforms that had been tan once but were now bleached nearly white by the desert sun, the letters PW painted across their backs in white paint, so bright you could see it from 100 yards away, and they looked just as scared and tired as American boys looked when they came home on leave, that same exhaustion in their eyes, that same uncertainty about what came next. Some of the Germans stumbled getting off the train, legs unsteady after the long journey from Norfolk, Virginia, where their ship had docked, 2 weeks crossing the Atlantic in cramped conditions. Then 2 days on the train through Virginia and Tennessee and Alabama, watching America pass by their windows, this vast country they'd been taught to hate, seeing farms and towns and ordinary people living ordinary lives. And you could see in their faces they hadn't expected this, hadn't expected America to look so peaceful, so untouched by war. One German dropped his small canvas bag getting off the train, and an American guard reached down and picked it up for him, handed it back, and the German said thank you in English. One of maybe 10 English words he knew, and that moment was witnessed by a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who was there with her son watching. And she told people later that's when she realized these weren't monsters, they were just boys, scared boys far from home. But you won't believe what those German prisoners built in the Mississippi heat over the next 3 years. Something so impossible that when engineers first proposed it, other engineers laughed. Called it fantasy, said the mathematics alone would take decades to work out, and the construction would require technology that didn't exist. Something that would end up saving billions of dollars and countless American lives for decades to come, preventing floods that would have killed thousands, protecting cities and farms across the entire Mississippi watershed, and most folks today don't even know the story. Don't know that enemy soldiers built one of the most important flood control tools America ever had. The story got told in pieces over the years. Men who worked at the site talked about it in bars and churches, told their sons and grandsons what they'd seen. German prisoners who came back to visit in the 50s and 60s told their side of it, brought photographs and memories, and if you put all those pieces together, if you listen to all the voices, you get something remarkable, a story about enemies building something together that nobody thought possible, about hatred giving way to respect, about war stopping long enough for peace to slip through. Clinton, Mississippi sits just outside Jackson, capital city of the state. Hot and humid from March through October, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back before you've walked 10 steps. Pine trees everywhere, and red clay dirt that turns to mud when it rains, and dust when it doesn't. Cotton fields stretching for miles in every direction. In 1943, the Army Corps of Engineers picked 790 acres of undeveloped land there for the most ambitious engineering project they'd ever attempted. They wanted to build a working model of the entire Mississippi River basin. Not just the main river, but every tributary, every creek, every floodplain, every reservoir, from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians, from the headwaters in Minnesota, clear down to the Gulf of Mexico, where the great river finally empties into the sea. All recreated in miniature on 1 square mile of Mississippi land. A scale model so precise that engineers could pump real water through it and watch how floods developed, test control measures before building them in real life, predict disasters before they happened. The idea came from Major General Eugene Raybould, Chief of the United States Corps of Engineers. A man who understood that the Mississippi River was both America's greatest resource and its greatest threat. The river moved goods and people, made farming possible across vast regions, but when it flooded, it killed hundreds and destroyed everything in its path. After the Great Flood of 1927 that left 600,000 people homeless and killed over 200, Raybould knew something had to be done. Engineers had been building levees and spillways for decades, trying to control the river section by section. But nobody understood how the whole system worked together, how a flood in Minnesota affected water levels in Missouri, how snowmelt in the Rockies combined with spring rains in Ohio to create catastrophic conditions in Louisiana. The mathematics was too complex, too many variables, too many unknowns. So Raybould proposed building a physical model, recreating the entire basin in miniature, where engineers could actually see water flowing, measure it, control it, test theories and solutions in a way that was impossible with just calculations and blueprints. But when he presented the idea to other engineers, they said it was impossible. The mathematics alone would take years, calculating the correct scale for 1.25 million square miles of landscape. Figuring out how to compress the horizontal distance by 2,000 while compressing the vertical distance by only 100, so the model would show proper water flow and not just look like a flat pancake. Working out how much earth needed to be moved to create each hill and valley, and how to recreate the texture of different surfaces so water would flow at the right speed. And the construction would require thousands of workers moving millions of cubic yards of earth by hand, shaping terrain to precise specifications, building drainage systems and miniature roads and bridges, creating landscape features that matched real geography down to the foot. Work that would take a decade at least, maybe 2 decades. With the war on, where would they find that many workers, every able-bodied man, was either in uniform or in a defense plant? Then something unexpected happened that changed everything, something that made the impossible suddenly possible. Today, welcome to this channel, and to an authentic World War II story, in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, and I have been telling stories of war for decades. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. In May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. The final German forces in North Africa, trapped between American armies advancing from the west and British armies advancing from the east, nowhere to run, no way to escape. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their weapons and became prisoners of war all at once. The largest surrender in the war up to that point, more prisoners than America had facilities to hold. The British were already overwhelmed with prisoners, their camps in Egypt and Libya at capacity, no room for more. Keeping the prisoners in North Africa meant shipping food and supplies across the Atlantic, where German U-boats were sinking dozens of ships every month, losing men and material just to feed prisoners. It made no sense. So somebody in Washington had an idea. Bring the prisoners to America, house them here where food was plentiful and shipping wasn't dangerous, put them to work on non-military projects under Geneva Convention rules, use them to fill labor shortages on farms and in forests. One of those projects, one of the biggest, would be the Mississippi River Basin model. The decision was made quickly. Prisoners started arriving in America in July 1943, shipped across the Atlantic in the same Liberty ships that carried supplies to Europe. The ships would have returned empty otherwise, so why not fill them with prisoners? The first group destined for Mississippi, 200 men from the Afrika Korps, most of them captured at the very end when resistance collapsed. Young men who'd never wanted to be in Africa in the first place. Conscripts who'd been drafted and sent to fight in a desert war they didn't understand for reasons that seemed less clear every day. They arrived in Clinton that August, stepped off the train looking exhausted and confused, blinking in the bright Mississippi sun after weeks in ship holds and rail cars. They were taken to Camp Clinton, a prisoner of war facility the army had just finished building on the edge of town, away from the main residential areas, but close enough that folks could see the guard towers from the highway. The camp was big, 150 buildings, including barracks that could hold 50 men each, mess halls that could feed hundreds at a time, an infirmary with real doctors and nurses, a chapel for religious services, recreation buildings with ping-pong tables, and a library. Guard towers with searchlights and machine guns, double fences of barbed wire with 15 feet of cleared ground between them so escaping prisoners would have nowhere to hide. Room for 3,000 men, eventually though only 200 arrived that first month. The camp was better than anything the Germans had expected. They'd been in temporary holding camps in North Africa where men slept on the ground and ate whatever the guards bothered to give them, then in ship holds where conditions were barely livable. Suddenly they were in barracks, with real beds and mattresses, eating 3 meals a day of decent food, getting medical attention for injuries and illnesses that had been ignored for months. Some of them couldn't believe it, thought it must be a trick, that the good treatment would end once the Americans got what they wanted. But it didn't end. The good treatment continued. The next morning American engineers came to get them, took the first group of 50 out to the work site. That's when the Germans understood what they were really there for, and some of them thought the Americans had lost their minds. The engineers walked them across 790 acres of raw land, flat and covered in scrub brush and pine trees, and that red Mississippi clay. Land that looked like nothing special, just undeveloped property that could have been anywhere in the South. Through interpreters, young American soldiers who'd learned German in college and now found themselves translating between engineers and prisoners, the Americans explained what they wanted built. A working hydraulic model of the entire Mississippi River drainage basin. 1.25 million square miles of landscape compressed into 1 square mile of Mississippi land, with a horizontal scale of 1 to 2,000 and a vertical scale of 1 to 100. Meaning if you stood in the model, you could walk from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians in half an hour, could trace the entire Mississippi River from Minnesota to Louisiana in 20 minutes. But the mountains would still rise high above you, 50 feet for the Rockies, 20 feet for the Appalachians, because the vertical scale was different, compressed less, so water would flow properly, and engineers could study flood dynamics. Every river would be there, every major tributary, the Missouri joining from the west, the Ohio from the east, the Arkansas, the Red, the Tennessee, the Illinois, dozens of smaller rivers, and hundreds of creeks. All of them precisely placed according to real geography, all of them carved into concrete channels that would carry real water pumped through the system so engineers could watch floods develop in real time, test levees and spillways before building them full scale, predict which areas would flood in different scenarios, save lives by knowing in advance where disasters would strike. The Germans looked at the empty land, looked at the topographic maps the Americans showed them, maps with every elevation marked, every river course plotted, looked at the wheelbarrows and shovels stacked nearby. You could see in their faces they thought this was insane. You couldn't build something like this with hand tools. The mathematics alone would take forever. The physical labor was beyond imagining. But then something started happening that nobody expected, something that would change the entire project. Among those first 200 prisoners were men who'd been engineers in civilian life before Hitler's war machine drafted them and sent them to Africa. German precision engineers from universities in Stuttgart and Munich and Berlin, men who'd studied mathematics and physics and hydraulics, men who'd built autobahns across Germany in the 30s, designed bridges and drainage systems and complex infrastructure. Men whose training and talent were being wasted digging trenches and moving supplies in North Africa until they got captured. One of them was Hans Werner, 30 years old, from Stuttgart. Tall and thin with wire-rimmed glasses that he'd somehow kept unbroken through months of combat and captivity. When the interpreter explained what the Americans wanted, Hans asked to see the topographic maps, studied them for several minutes while the other Germans watched, and the American engineers waited to see what he'd say. Hans traced the Mississippi River on the map with his finger, followed the tributaries, studied the elevation markers, did calculations in his head. Then he looked up at the Americans and said in broken English, carefully pronouncing each word, "This could work, this is difficult, but this is possible. If we work carefully and use proper mathematics, this can be built." That changed everything in an instant. Suddenly, this wasn't just prisoner labor being forced to dig ditches. This was German engineers recognizing the value of what the Americans wanted, volunteering their expertise, offering to help make it work. The American engineers who'd been skeptical themselves, who'd wondered if this project was even possible, they saw hope for the first time. The lead American engineer, a man named Colonel William Morrison, had been at the site since the planning phase began, had spent months working out preliminary calculations. When Hans Werner offered to help, offered to bring his engineering knowledge to the project, Morrison realized they might actually be able to do this, might be able to build something that would save American lives for generations. Morrison spoke through the interpreter, asked Hans if there were other engineers among the prisoners, men with technical training who could help with surveying and calculations, and construction planning. Hans said yes. At least 20 men in this first group alone had engineering or construction backgrounds, and more would be arriving in future prisoner shipments. So Morrison made a decision that changed the entire project. Instead of treating the Germans as simple laborers who would just follow orders and move dirt, he organized them into technical teams. Put the German engineers to work on actual engineering tasks, let them help with surveying and planning and problem solving, gave them responsibility, and treated them as colleagues instead of enemies. This was unusual. Most prisoner of war camps in America used prisoners for basic agricultural work or simple construction, picking cotton or harvesting crops or building roads. But Morrison understood that he had something rare here. Trained engineers who could make the impossible possible, and he was willing to work with them regardless of what flag they'd fought under. The work began in earnest that fall. German surveyors laying out the initial grid, marking where rivers would flow, where mountains would rise, where valleys would sink. Translating topographic maps into stakes in the ground that showed every elevation change, every significant feature. The German surveyors were excellent, better than most American surveyors according to folks who watched them work. They moved with precision and speed, checked measurements twice, caught errors before they became problems. When asked where they'd learned to survey so well, they explained they'd worked on Autobahn construction in Germany in the 30s, those massive highway projects that required surveying across hundreds of miles of varied terrain. More prisoners arrived every month. Camp Clinton grew from 200 men to 500, then 1,000, then 3,000 by Christmas 1944. Among them were more engineers, more skilled workers, carpenters and electricians and machinists, men whose talents could be put to use on this massive project. The officers among the prisoners weren't required to work under Geneva Convention rules. German officers and non-commissioned officers could sit in their barracks all day if they wanted, read books, write letters home, play chess, just wait out the war in relative comfort while enlisted men did the physical labor. But most of them volunteered, chose to work in the Mississippi heat because they understood they were building something historic, something that would outlast the war, something that mattered. Hans Werner was one of the first to volunteer, showed up at the work site that first Monday morning when he could have stayed in his bunk, could have spent the day in shade reading or relaxing. When Morrison asked through the interpreter why he was there, Hans said in his careful English, slowly pronouncing each word, "Because when will I ever get to build something like this again? This is engineering history. This will save lives, maybe German lives too someday if they build something like this in Europe." That answer spread through both groups, German prisoners and American engineers, and it changed how people saw the project completely. This wasn't Americans using German slave labor anymore. This wasn't guards forcing prisoners to dig ditches as punishment. This was engineers of different nations working together on something bigger than the war, bigger than politics, bigger than national hatred. This was people building something that would save lives, regardless of what flag those lives flew. More Germans started volunteering after they heard what Hans said. By September, over half, the officers and non-commissioned officers at Camp Clinton were working on the model when they didn't have to, when they could have sat in air-conditioned recreation halls instead. That made American engineers respect them, made guards who'd thought all Germans were fanatics realize these men were just people doing their jobs, trying to find meaning in captivity. The work progressed through winter and into spring, through summer heat and fall rains. The site transforming from raw land into something recognizable, something that looked like what the topographic maps promised. Miniature streets and roads built first, a grid system covering the entire square mile so materials could be moved efficiently. Roads wide enough for trucks to pass, graded properly so water would drain, with ditches on both sides because even miniature landscapes flood in Mississippi. Then the major features began taking shape. Earth moving began in earnest, with hundreds of wheelbarrows going constantly. Germans filling them with red clay, pushing them to wherever the elevation needed to change, dumping them, going back for more. Thousands of trips every day, millions of trips over the months and years, each wheelbarrow load changing the landscape by a few cubic feet. Think about that scale for a moment. They moved over 1 million cubic yards of earth total, and a wheelbarrow, when you fill it proper, holds maybe 2 cubic feet. That's roughly 27 million wheelbarrow loads moved one at a time by human beings, pushing those simple, one-wheeled carts across Mississippi clay that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. Every load had to go exactly where the surveyors marked because elevations had to match real geography within inches. The work was backbreaking in ways that are hard to imagine today. August in Mississippi is brutal. Temperatures reaching over 100 degrees with humidity to match, the kind of heat that soaks through everything and makes every movement feel like swimming through thick air. The Germans had fought in North Africa, where temperatures were even higher, but that was dry heat. Mississippi humidity was different, wet and oppressive, making sweat stick to skin instead of evaporating to cool you down. They worked 6 days a week, 8 hours a day in summer, starting at 6 in the morning trying to beat the worst heat. Assembled at camp for breakfast, oatmeal and coffee and bread, plain food but plenty of it. Then loaded into army trucks, 20 men per truck, driven out to the site where wheelbarrows and shovels waited. The German surveyors were meticulous about this. They'd check elevations 3 times before letting anyone dump earth, would stop work, and remeasure if something looked wrong. They understood that if the elevations were off even slightly, the water wouldn't flow right. The whole model would be useless, all that work wasted. The German engineers had pride in their work. You could see it in how carefully they checked measurements, how they'd argue with each other in rapid German about proper slopes and drainage patterns, using technical terms that the American engineers recognized even without understanding the language. How they'd stay late studying maps by lamplight in the barracks, working out calculations on scraps of paper. How they'd volunteer to redo entire sections if they weren't satisfied with the quality, refusing to accept anything less than precise. This wasn't just prisoner labor passing time anymore. These men cared deeply about what they were building. Some of them said later it was the first time since being captured that they felt like engineers instead of prisoners, the first time their skills mattered for something constructive rather than destructive. By spring 1944, you could see the Rocky Mountains rising on the western edge of the site, 50 feet of carefully shaped earth and concrete, representing peaks that were actually 14,000 feet high in real life. You could trace the Missouri River flowing east from those mountains, joining the main Mississippi at the correct angle, the correct elevation. Could see where the Platte joined the Missouri, where the Kansas joined, every tributary placed according to real geography with the precision of surveying equipment and German engineering excellence. The work crews were organized by skill and nationality, maximizing efficiency. German engineers working with American engineers on technical problems, sharing knowledge across language barriers through the universal language of mathematics and hydraulics. German carpenters building wooden forms for concrete channels, creating templates that would be used dozens of times across the site. German surveyors working with American surveyors to verify elevations, double-checking each other's work, catching errors before they became permanent problems embedded in concrete. Through all of this, through months of working together 6 days a week, in that Mississippi heat, relationships developed that nobody expected, friendships that nobody would have predicted. There was a moment in April 1944 that people talked about for years afterward. A spring storm came through Mississippi, heavy rain and strong wind, the kind of weather that tears through the South with little warning. Part of the miniature Appalachian Mountains section collapsed overnight, weeks of careful earth-moving washed away in a few hours. Gullies carved through shaped terrain, elevations destroyed that had taken dozens of men weeks to create. The American engineers thought the Germans would be discouraged, would lose motivation, would see this as proof the whole project was futile. But the opposite happened. Hans Werner gathered the German workers the next morning before the Americans arrived, spoke to them in German for several minutes while pointing at the damaged section, his voice calm but intense. The other Germans listened carefully, nodding, and when he finished speaking they picked up their tools and went to work rebuilding what the storm destroyed. Worked extra hours without being asked, stayed late into the evening when they could have returned to camp. Approached the repair with even more care than the original construction, determined to make it stronger this time, more resistant to future storms. When Morrison asked Hans through the interpreter what he'd said to motivate them, Hans smiled and said, "I told them good engineering survives storms, we just have to build it right this time. I told them we're not just moving dirt, we're building something that will save lives, and lives matter too much to let a little rain defeat us." That dedication impressed the Americans deeply, made them realize these Germans weren't just going through the motions or working because guards forced them. They genuinely cared about the project succeeding. They'd taken ownership of it in a way that went beyond national loyalty or military duty. After that, the American engineers started treating the German engineers more like true colleagues, asking their opinions on technical problems, implementing their suggestions without hesitation, acknowledging their contributions in official project meetings and progress reports. Summer 1944 was brutal. Temperatures over 100 degrees most days, humidity so thick you could barely breathe, the kind of weather that makes you understand why Mississippi folks move slowly. Men working outdoors in that heat could only manage a few hours before needing rest, risking heat stroke if they pushed too hard. So they adapted, worked in shifts to avoid the worst of it. Early morning shift from dawn until 10, when the sun was still climbing and temperatures were bearable. Late afternoon shift from 4 until dark, after the peak heat had passed, and evening breezes sometimes brought relief. Nobody worked during midday unless absolutely necessary, those hours between 10 and 4 when the sun beat down mercilessly, and even standing still made sweat pour. The prisoners earned 90 cents a day in camp scrip, not real money, but vouchers they could spend at the camp store. Could buy cigarettes if they smoked, candy if they wanted something sweet, toiletries like soap and razor blades and toothpaste. Some of them saved their scrip for weeks to buy materials for hobbies. Wood for carving, paper for drawing, paint for artwork. The things they created in their free time showed who they'd been before the war, revealed the men beneath the prisoner of war uniforms. One German prisoner named Dietrich Lobeck had been a clockmaker in Hamburg. He spent his free time building miniature wooden clocks from scrap lumber, intricate mechanisms that actually kept time. He gave one to Colonel Morrison as a gift when Christmas came, and Morrison kept that clock on his desk for the rest of his life, wound it every morning. When people asked about it, he'd tell them a German prisoner made it, made them understand that enemies could still create beautiful things. There was another German named Johann Schmidt who'd been a painter before the war. He painted watercolor landscapes of Mississippi from memory during his off hours, trying to capture the particular quality of light through pine trees, the way morning fog sat in valleys, the color of red clay after rain. When he was repatriated in 1946, he left several paintings with the camp administration as thanks for fair treatment. And there was the tunnel escape attempt that became legendary at Camp Clinton, happened in November 1944. A group of about 30 Germans spent 3 months digging a tunnel from Barrack 7 toward the fence line, working at night after lights out, after guards made their rounds, taking turns digging while others kept watch. One man would dig for an hour while 3 others watched, then they'd rotate, fresh digger taking over. Disposing of dirt was the hardest part, always the challenge in any tunnel escape. They couldn't just pile it somewhere, guards would notice immediately. So they devised an ingenious system. Stuffed dirt into trouser legs with strings tied at the ankles, creating makeshift bags. Then walked around the compound during the day, gradually dumping small amounts where it wouldn't be noticed. In the vegetable gardens where prisoners helped grow food. Along fence lines where guards wouldn't look twice, mixed into regular dirt paths that thousands of feet wore down every day. The tunnel itself was genuinely impressive from an engineering standpoint. Over 100 feet long, approximately 3 feet square, just big enough for a man to crawl through. Shored up with wooden planks salvaged from shipping crates, each plank carefully measured and cut to size, fitted together with precision. Ventilated with a chimney pipe made from soldered tin cans that ran back to the barracks floor, clever engineering that prevented suffocation underground. The entrance was hidden under a locker that could be moved aside, the floor beneath cut away and fitted back so perfectly you couldn't see the seam unless you knew where to look. Sophisticated enough that it might have worked, might have gotten all 30 men out before anyone noticed, if the ground hadn't settled. But Mississippi soil is tricky, red clay that shifts and compacts. The tunnel created a void underground that the earth above eventually sagged into. Created a depression about 10 feet from the fence line, subtle at first but growing more pronounced. A guard on tower duty noticed it one morning in early February 1945, pointed it out to his sergeant. When they excavated, they found the tunnel 10 feet from breaking through to freedom. Colonel Morrison had the 30 Germans who dug the tunnel brought to his office. The men lined up expecting the worst, expecting solitary confinement, or worse, maybe beatings. Morrison looked them over for a long moment, these dirty, tired men who'd spent 3 months crawling through Mississippi clay trying to get home. And something remarkable started happening between the German prisoners and the Americans they worked with. The engineers and the guards and the townspeople. Relationships that nobody expected, friendships that crossed the war, moments of connection that reminded everyone involved that underneath the uniforms and the languages and the politics were just human beings trying to survive. There was a young American nurse named Marion Rogers Wells who worked at the camp infirmary. 21 years old when she started, from a small farm outside Jackson, daughter of cotton farmers who'd never traveled more than 50 miles from home. She treated sick and injured German prisoners with the same care she'd give American soldiers. Set broken bones with gentle hands, tended infections with proper medicine, sat with fevered men through the night speaking soft words they couldn't understand, but that somehow comforted them anyway. She learned a few German words from the prisoners, basic medical terms, and pleasantries. They learned English from her, simple phrases like, "Thank you and feel better," and "See you tomorrow." These small linguistic exchanges built bridges that policy couldn't, made enemies see each other as individuals with names and stories and families waiting somewhere. The Germans appreciated her care deeply, treated her with utmost respect, called her Schwester Marion, Sister Marion. When she walked through the compound, men would nod respectfully, step aside to let her pass. She never felt threatened or afraid, despite being a young woman surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, because they understood she cared for them when nobody else would. One German prisoner named Erich Becker, captured in Tunisia when he was just 19 years old, barely old enough to shave, became friends with Marion through repeated visits to the infirmary for various minor ailments. Sprained ankle from construction work, bad cold during winter, cut hand from barbed wire. They'd talk through an interpreter about home and family, and what they missed most. Marion realized this German teenager was exactly like her younger brother Tommy, who was serving somewhere in France with the Third Army, probably no more than a few years apart in age. She showed Eric a photograph of Tommy in his uniform. Eric showed her a photograph of his sister back in Germany. They both cried a little looking at those pictures, understanding that the war was making everyone suffer, that families on both sides were worried sick about children far from home, that humanity didn't stop at borders. There was Robert Patterson, one of the American civilian engineers working on the project. Quiet man from Tennessee, about 40 years old, who loved woodworking as a hobby, made furniture in his garage back home. He noticed that some of the German prisoners were carving wooden figures in their free time, sitting on barrack steps in the evening with pocket knives, whittling pieces of scrap pine into boats and animals and little houses. Patterson started bringing them better tools from his personal collection, small chisels and files and sandpaper, things that made the carving easier and more detailed. The Germans were grateful, started showing him what they'd made, explaining their techniques. Even though they often couldn't speak each other's languages, they communicated through craft, through the universal language of making things with your hands. One German prisoner carved Patterson a small wooden figure of an engineer with a transit, incredibly detailed, barely 3 inches tall. Patterson kept it on his desk at home for the rest of his life, showed it to his children and grandchildren, used it to tell them about the German prisoners he'd worked with, about how people can find common ground even when their countries are at war. Christmas 1944 was better than Christmas 1943 had been. The Germans organized a Christmas service in their chapel with a tree they decorated, sang German carols. This time, American guards didn't just stand outside listening, they were invited in from the start. About 20 Americans sat in the back of the chapel while Germans sang Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum. Several Americans joined in on Silent Night because they knew that one, and for a few hours on Christmas Eve 1944, the war seemed very far away. The camp administration let the Germans cook traditional Christmas foods that year, gave them extra rations to make Stollen and Lebkuchen, German Christmas bread, and gingerbread. The Germans shared some with the American guards. Marion Rogers Wells, the nurse, said later, that was when she really understood these men weren't her enemies. They were just homesick boys who wanted to remember better times. Spring 1945 brought news of Germany's collapse, Hitler dead by suicide in his bunker, German armies surrendering across Europe, the war in Europe finally over. The German prisoners at Camp Clinton heard this news with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, sadness for what Germany had become under Hitler, uncertainty about what came next, whether they'd ever see their families again, whether their hometowns still existed. The Americans thought the prisoners would be sent home quickly after Germany surrendered in May. But President Truman decided to keep them in America through 1946, using them to fill labor shortages until American soldiers could return from overseas and take jobs. This decision made many Germans bitter at first. They'd expected to go home, expected to see families they hadn't seen in 3 years. But then they realized Germany was destroyed, divided between Soviet and Western occupation zones, cities in rubble, food scarce, chaos everywhere. Staying in America a bit longer where they were fed and housed and doing meaningful work didn't seem so bad. Some like Eric Becker even asked if they could stay permanently, immigrate after the war, but American law didn't allow it, required repatriation. So the German prisoners at Clinton continued working on the model through 1945 and into 1946. Now building something for a country that had defeated their nation, but learning to respect it, learning that America wasn't what their propaganda had told them, wasn't brutal or barbaric, was in fact more civilized in some ways than what they'd known in Germany. The model neared completion in spring 1946. Final sections being finished, water systems tested, pumps installed that could move thousands of gallons per minute through the miniature river system, creating realistic flood conditions that engineers could study. The German prisoners who'd worked on it from the beginning could see their 3 years of labor taking final form. In April 1946, they did the first full system test, pumped water through every river and tributary simultaneously, watched miniature floods develop just as the mathematics predicted. Saw water flow from the Rockies to the Gulf exactly as it would in real life, but compressed in time and space. The test worked perfectly, validated years of calculations and construction. Hans Werner stood with Colonel Morrison watching that first test, watching water flow through channels he'd helped design. Morrison said through the interpreter that this was one of the great engineering achievements of the century. Hans nodded and said, "We built something good. This will save American lives. Maybe that makes up for some of what Germany did. Those last weeks before repatriation were bittersweet." Germans saying goodbye to Americans they'd worked beside for 3 years, exchanging addresses, promising to write. Some of those friendships lasted decades, letters crossing the Atlantic even through the Cold War years. In May 1946, the last German prisoners left Camp Clinton, shipped to East Coast ports for repatriation to Germany 3 years after they'd arrived. Many of them didn't want to leave. Germany was destroyed, occupied by 4 powers, divided, uncertain. America had treated them well, fed them, let them do meaningful work, respected their skills. Some like Eric Becker asked if they could stay, but American law required repatriation. The final group of Germans leaving in May 1946 included Hans Werner. He asked through an interpreter if he could see the completed model one last time. Morrison drove him out to the site, walked him through the miniature Mississippi basin he'd helped create. Hans stood there looking at 50 feet of miniature Rocky Mountains and said, "This will save lives. I am proud we built this." Morrison shook his hand, said, "We couldn't have done it without you." Hans got back in the truck and left Mississippi, left America, went home to a Germany that wasn't really home anymore. But the story didn't end there. Over the next decades, many of those German prisoners came back to Mississippi to visit, brought their families, showed their children and grandchildren what they'd built. The Americans who'd worked with them welcomed them back. Hans Werner returned in 1962 with his daughter, now a civil engineer herself. They toured the model together, Hans explaining how it worked, pointing out sections he'd personally designed. Marion Rogers Wells, the nurse from the camp infirmary, heard he was visiting and came to meet him. They talked about the war years like they were college memories. Eric Becker came back in 1996, 72 years old. He found Marion Wells again. She was 74 then. They sat in her living room looking at old photographs from Camp Clinton. Eric said through his son, who translated, "You made us feel human when we were prisoners. That meant everything." The Mississippi River Basin model became operational in 1949, 3 years after the last German prisoners left. It worked exactly as designed. Engineers pumped water through the system, watched floods develop in miniature, tested levee modifications, spillway operations, reservoir releases, seeing in hours what would take months or years to see in real life. The model predicted the 1952 Missouri River floods and helped save Kansas City from catastrophic damage. Predicted the 1973 Old River Control Structure crisis and helped prevent the Mississippi from permanently changing course. Prevented an estimated $5 billion in flood damage over its operational lifetime, saved countless lives. The Germans who built it never got credit in official records. Project reports listed it as a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers achievement, didn't mention the 3,000 prisoners who moved earth in Mississippi heat. But the people who were there knew. The engineers and guards and townspeople remembered, told their children about enemy soldiers building something to protect America. The model operated until 1973, 24 years, then was decommissioned as computer modeling became more sophisticated. But even after it shut down, engineers said the physical model had taught them things no computer could show, had helped them understand water dynamics in ways that changed how they approached flood control. The site sat abandoned for years. Concrete cracking, weeds growing through river channels, water pumps rusting. By 2010, most people in Clinton didn't even know what it was. just some strange landscape feature in Buddy Butts Park, miniature mountains nobody understood. Then in 2016, a group called Friends of the Mississippi River Basin Model organized to preserve what remained. Started giving tours, teaching Mississippi children about engineering and history, explaining that German prisoners built this, that enemy soldiers created something that saved American lives for decades. You can visit the site today, walk the paths those German prisoners built, trace the rivers they carved, climb to where the Rockies rise, and look out over the miniature America they created. If you stand there long enough, if you really think about what happened, you understand something important. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. The Mississippi River Basin Model wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was a moment when war stopped and work began, when enemies became colleagues, when shared purpose overcame hatred. The fact that it happened in Mississippi in 1943, at the height of the war, makes it even more remarkable. Hans Werner said it best when he came back in 1995, 77 years old, walking through the model with his grandson. A reporter asked how he felt about working on an American project while Germany was fighting America. Hans thought about it, then said through his grandson, who translated, "We were building something, not destroying something. In war you destroy, in peace you build. For 3 years I got to be an engineer instead of a soldier. I am proud of what we built here. It saved lives. That matters more than flags." That's the story that truly needs remembering today. Not just the remarkable engineering achievement, but the deep humanity behind it. Not just the concrete and steel infrastructure, but the profound choice those men made every morning when they picked up their wheelbarrows and went to work in the relentless Mississippi heat. Building something that would outlast the war, outlast the hatred, outlast the politics, and save American lives for many generations to come. A legacy that endures even now, decades later, in the flood control systems that protect millions. In the engineering principles that changed how America approached water management. In the memory of enemies who became colleagues, who chose to build instead of destroy, who proved that even in the darkest times humanity can prevail, and powerful truth resonating still across all of those decades since those years.